I'd like to raise an issue that's very focused so that I can get a better idea of your different responses. And we already heard a little bit about landmines. And as you know, anti-personnel landmines are designed to maim rather than kill because they tie up more troops. And they also sit around after the war is over, killing a lot of civilians. So how do all these different positions come down on the use of landmines in warfare?
That's a very important question, and again, the Ottawa Convention addresses that specifically, for which the U.S., China, and Russia are not signatories for that. As I mentioned, there are two cases the United States reserves the use of anti-personnel landmines, so let's talk about that particular class, which is only in the demilitarized zone in Korea. And also, we allow training for our soldiers in landmines, which is kind of strange, which leads to potential use somewhere downstream. By some definitions, including mine, a landmine is a robot, and it's an autonomous robot. It is tasked for a particular thing. It has the ability to sense the world through actuation of a pressure plate or something else, and then actuate, which is in this case through an explosion. Cognition isn't always necessarily a vital component of landmines. The real problem is the indiscriminate nature of the landmines themselves, which makes them inherently immoral, if not illegal, in their use. There has been work that has been done to try and reduce the use of landmines and create landmines that will become safer and the like, but it is I believe I can't speak for our nation, I speak as an individual, but I believe it's our nation's policy right now to not use them except in that one particular instance. There's another class of mines, though, which is far more discriminatory, things like anti-tank mines, which can appear on a road. These are not IEDs, which just blow up anything, perhaps, that goes by, but they may have seismic signatures or infrared signatures, which are inherently discriminatory, and I don't believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, unless proven to be non-discriminatory, a superfluous injury is what you were describing in the particular case, which is against just war theory and enshrined in many aspects of the Geneva Conventions, are also not necessarily inherent in that, but they have to be proven and complied by lawyers before they can move out into the battlefield under those sets of circumstances. So I hope that helps.
In view of the fact that computers and therefore drones can be hacked and brought under the control of an actor other than the original with very likely other intentions, how will that affect drone warfare?
Sure, let me take a quick stab at that. Not only can they be, they have. A University of Texas professor just recently spoofed a ground station for one of... Spoof means it mimics the ground station. So it took over from the actual operator's ground station and started to control the drone in that location. And he demonstrated this to the appropriate military personnel. Part of it is, it's an inherent communications problem. There's a trade-off when you're talking to a drone and controlling a drone in terms of computing bandwidth, how much data can I get back, how real time can it be, versus the notion of encryption, which makes everything take longer, is the best way to do it. Also, the Taliban have additionally received radio links from and see the downloaded video from one of the predators as well too, and I'm not sure where that was, Pakistan or Iran, excuse me, no, Iraq. And also we lost a UAV. The Beast of Kandahar ended up in Iran. All these things argue for two things. One is much better cybersecurity, but I won't say that any system is unable to be hacked, but a cyber command has been stood up by the US government to address cybersecurity at many different dimensions, and that's a command, not just a little office somewhere to deal with that. So that's an important distinction. And as the technological superiority of our enemies increases, we're more likely to use more and more restrictive capabilities. All of those things, I think, play an important role in addressing those problems, but they are understood, but we need to be careful in that regard. And it pushes for autonomy is the other thing. So if someone takes over you think you're hearing from not your commanding officer, you should have the ability to make that decision on your own, is the notion behind more and more autonomy.
And there's also an interesting issue more broadly for society as a whole, because the more we become reliant on our technological, our cyber systems, the more we create vulnerabilities if an opponent chooses to carry out unrestricted warfare against the United States. So there was talk in our console that some potential opponents of the United States might already have launched a long-term attack on the United States that would consist of degrading our network capabilities, but doing so in such a way that it never rises to the point where the United States is able to respond to it. This death of 1,000 cuts for a culture like the United States could be a very effective long-term attack. Right now, it would tend to fall between the sort of civilian defenses against cyber, which are pretty pathetic, to summarize it, and the military responses, which are the kinds of things we talked about. So what it means is that there are huge vulnerabilities from an overall security perspective that already exist and are not being addressed and may be in the process of being taken advantage of already. That's if you're interested and want to sleep well.
So let me ask the following question here. Would a cyber attack on the United States intended to knock us off of our #1 spot in the world's economy be considered an attack? Okay. And one can argue that over a period of 100 years, perhaps, some other nation might become #1 in this world. A nation perhaps that maybe has 1.5 billion people now and is populated with people who unfortunately look like me. And so the interesting question is, have you heard reports about China hacking into American companies to steal our intellectual property? Right? And we've all heard about that. Is that part of a long-term attack? And how do we respond to that?
This is kind of a cheerful note to end it on. It is now 12 o'clock. With the permission of the panel, and I know some of you have to go, I'm willing to stay here and respond to the questions that we have. Those of you that are interested, please feel free to stay. We will respond to them and we'll keep recording them. Those of you that understood that this was to end at 12 o'clock and want to leave, please do leave quietly. I would also like to thank the questioners so far who have been very good in keeping their questions brief and to the point, and we will continue those for a couple of minutes because I do want the people that have waited to get an opportunity to speak.
Andrew Zolli, when he spoke yesterday, talked about resilience, and he gave two stories of the bicyclist wearing helmet, encouraged the taxi drivers to drive closer and more aggressively, and the English countryside where the hedges were trimmed, encouraged the drivers to drive faster and create more accidents. And my question is, shouldn't the lawyers in this case be thinking more about how to put the genie back in the bottle rather than facilitate and encourage the testosterone race where we assume that technology has an unbridled right to create whatever it wants? Speaking as a technologist of 4 decades practice, there are many things which I think should be put back in the bottle. And that allows us to deal with low tech, such as landmines and IEDs, as well as high tech.
Well, this is something that all of us were deeply worried about. And the question that I think this tendency that you refer to, often called the technological imperative, if we can do it, then we will, regardless of whether we should, seems to drive people on the technology side especially, which is why it's so important to have this kind of, I think what Peter W. Singer, author of Wired for War, called the precautionary principle, That is, early on in the development of a technology, is it not wise to try the best you can to reflect upon what its likely implications will be, not just its military uses and abuses, but its impact on the civilian population, sometimes called civilian blowback, and its ability to transform cultures. That said, that is a very difficult thing to do, and usually the predictions that are made in advance are about as far off as they can be. I don't think anybody thought cell phones would be used by teenagers to text while they're driving, causing accidents. I mean, had you been thinking about that in advance, that's probably not a scenario you would have thought of. And the other side of the tragic element of this is once the technology is developed and beginning, to move forward, it has its advocates, it has its critics, but it's very hard to pull it off the drawing board and bring it back. So we're interested in promoting, as far as we can, that image of the precautionary principle and the reflection by the communities of practice and engineering that are developing the technologies to think about ways in which they can be both used and misused prior to manufacturing them and sending them out there. It's the best I think we can do.
That's a hugely interesting question, and I spent a lot of time looking at that myself because I wanted to see whether the genie, since I used the term, could be put back in the bottle. And the first thing that occurred to me very quickly is that I'm the operator, I'm the guy with the guns, I'm the guy who's going to come to your lab and tell you, you can't do that, okay? And put you in jail if you say, no, I have a right to do this, okay? So I'm not sure I want to be in a position of doing that. But secondly, having done the reading with regard to the history of technology, which is kind of where I went to find out the answer, it appears, especially in democratic spaces or spaces where there's lots of freedom, is that innovation happens. It's happening today, as you well know, in garages and basements in various places. It's very infinitely more democratic than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's not really in the arms of the state. There's not three guys in the Pentagon who can say, genie, get back in the bottle. It's not going to happen anymore. Much of it comes off the shelf at Radio Shack.
A momentary rebuttal. If we just reflect...
Very quick, please, sir, because we...
Momentary. If we just reflect on the damage that's been done to our financial system by lack of regulation and the folks who are now thinking about regulating it. I said the lawyers should think about this. The technologists won't.
Let me comment quickly on that. I appreciate your comment, and very senior technologists have thought it's much worse than what you're depicting. Bill Joy, if you read his article in Wired about a decade ago called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, actually argues that much of the technology that we are creating, robotics technology, nanotechnology, and genetics engineering, are not only going to cause a problem in the battlefield, they're going to lead to the extinction of humanity in his particular case. Where did he get this idea? He got it from reading the Unabomber Manifesto, which is one thing I actually have my class read as well, too, in terms of understanding the divergent points of view on this. So your point is well taken. It is shared by many. It is a challenging one, and certainly we all, I think, believe, urge and encourage restraint as best as we possibly can, given the other pressures, often which are the drumbeat of war, to address these technologies in different ways.
The reports of the panel would indicate that the discussion was primarily how you apply the emerging technologies to the conduct of war with respect to the ethics of the conduct of war. Was any attention given to how can you marshal the emerging technologies to not get into war in the first place? Did the panel do that? And should the panel have done that?
Actually, that came up. We did a sort of summary of points learned at the end of the panel, and there were a number of technical issues. One of the issues that came up, it was introduced by another member of the panel who isn't up here, was precisely that point. How do we understand technologies in such a way as to minimize the possibility of war? The complexity that's introduced by the environment that you ask that question is also interesting because, of course, we haven't been in a war. If by war you mean a declared war, since World War II. So everything that has happened since then has not been a war. To those of us that got drafted, that's news, but that was the status. So you have very differing kinds of conflict now. That is a very good question. It's one that the panel did not directly address. One of the things that came out of our discussions were a lot of areas that would be important to explore to begin to flesh out a broad and rigorous perspective on that kind of space. So yeah, very good question.